No less than 7 military air arms in the approach to the millennium used the Harrier jump jet worldwide. But in the 1960s, it was touch and go as to whether the Harrier project would ever see the light of day. The Harrier story is one of indecision, political intrigue, and military disagreements. The Spanish were one of the few nations to have believed in the capabilities of a truly remarkable aircraft, but even they had problems in equipping their navy with the aircraft of their choice. Originally, the Spanish looked to Britain for the machines. But as there was a military embargo against Spain under its dictator Franco, so he was forced to buy from the American McDonnell Douglas Company. Such was the political situation at that time. Again, as so often has happened throughout the history of aviation, Britain was to be the loser. The Spanish version of the AV-8B isn't called Harrier at all. It's aptly named Matador. In 1996, 4 of Spain's Matadors were scrambled for a daring attack from their base on the aircraft carrier Príncipe de Asturias. Their mission was to find a British warship somewhere in the North Sea, sink it, and return to base in one piece.
The second barrier is also at a bearing of green 45 from 8 miles out to 30 miles plus.
As the Matadors approached, the crew on board HMS Campbelltown prepared for action.
First aircraft, green 80, guys, left phone. Continue ready. Start battery, aircraft bearing green. Craft green, 70. Shift target left.
Of course, this was just an exercise, but it had to be made as real as possible.
We always have an annual exercise in the North Atlantic involving most of the Atlantic nations with their armed forces, their navies, their air forces. It's extremely important and very valuable.
In fact, both the Matadors and the Tornadoes were doing their impersonation of Exocet missiles being fired from long range, and in reality, the cruiser would probably have shot them down. The Matadors all returned safely to their base under the watchful eye of Rear Admiral Lorenzo, who was AC Task Force.
The world has changed, so the exercise scenarios change. The current exercise reveals that. What we're practicing is NATO's crisis management procedures, how to prevent war rather than how to fight it.
In the 1990s, the recurrent theme is the prevention of war, which means that the role of the Harrier, or in this case the Matador, has changed radically since Chief Test Pilot Bill Bedford first rather heavily landed the embryo P-1127 on the deck of HMS Ark Royal back in 1963.
When we landed aboard, flag off for aircraft carriers said in 1963, the thing that impressed me most was the complete absence of fright on the part of the spectators. Normally new airplanes come on board bigger, heavier and faster, and here was a reversal of the trend.
The Royal Navy wasn't too impressed. Since those early days, all the techniques of landing and flying the Harrier have smoothed out into a thoroughbred of the air. The Harrier too can literally land on a sixpence very smoothly. But back in 1963, the Royal Navy wanted a supersonic aircraft if it was to go VSTOL, and the prospect of an aircraft that could land and take off vertically was seen as a threat to its carrier fleet. Indeed, it was felt that the Harrier could render the aircraft carrier obsolete. In this modern world, exercises like this are designed to keep pilots, ground crews, seamen, and the thousands of backup personnel in the peak of readiness.
The Falkland conflict was 14 years ago. The vast majority of the young sailors in all the ships here now, and particularly the British ships, were not in the Navy in those days, and so we constantly have to learn our lessons.
A classic example of lessons being learned was the breakup of the former Yugoslavia in 1991. The country had become well known as a place to go for a pleasant holiday, but in the background was a festering racialism and almost tribal hatred between Serbs and Croats, Muslims and Christians. The nation was broken up into Slovenia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro, and Croatia. The ethnic groups sought dominance in their own regions. The Serbs were the most aggressive in their beliefs, but they were not the only ones guilty of ethnic cleansing. By 1993, full-scale war was being waged in the Balkans. The United Nations organized troops for humanitarian relief, and in March 1993, the UN authorized action to ban all flights of fixed and rotary-winged aircraft over the airspace in the Republic of Bosnia. Operation Deny Flight was instigated by NATO to deny the Serbian Air Force the ability to attack targets in Bosnia-Herzegovina. The eyes and ears of the NATO flyers was the Boeing Sentry, which had already proved invaluable in the Gulf War. The carriers Invincible and Ark Royal patrolled the waters of the Adriatic.
Here we are, poised in international waters. We're beholden to no one. We are, in fact, a go-anywhere airfield. So it doesn't matter where the wind comes from, or if fog comes and prevents them flying from the shore, then we still have the ability to do that from the sea. Ark Royal is poised in the Adriatic so that we can provide support to the British Army, which is ashore in Bosnia, aiding the United Nations humanitarian effort. We do this by flying our Sea Harriers over the Bosnia to provide close air support if necessary. Now we hope that we will not have to drop any bombs, and indeed in our experience the very noise and sight of the aircraft coming over the top is sufficient to make people stop firing.
For a pilot, a Harrier is arguably the ultimate experience. It can go fast, it can drop bombs, it can fire missiles, it can hover, it can do just about anything you would want to do. It's always a challenge. At the end of a tiring sortie, landing back on the ship, particularly in rough weather, can be more difficult than everything else that's come before. So there's never a need to relax or take it easy, because the airplane will fight you if you don't watch out. Although it's small, we can carry missiles, bombs, guns as well. We're also capable of doing air-to-air refueling if we put an air-to-air refueling probe on, which can extend the range and the endurance of the aircraft. So out here particularly, and for literal warfare, we've got a small but very capable aircraft that can meet whatever is required, really.
RAF GR7 Harriers were deployed from their land bases in Italy. They were equipped for a night fighting role using the FLIR infrared system. But at this stage of the conflict, the RAF agreed with the Navy.
No, we don't actually want to be dropping the bombs. It's a threat of dropping the bombs, I think, that it's about. The flexibility, you know, we get airborne and you can tell us to go anywhere in the theatre and we can go there. We've got the fuel, we've got the range, we've got the bombs that we carry. And again, it's, you know, carrying the big stick, if you like, the threat. You know, we all hear about drawing the lines in the sand. Well, we're part of that. I mean, we are that line. You know, you step beyond it, the guys on the ground then can call upon us, you know, to give them some help.
This time it's a UK GR7 Harrier aircraft, once again on an ammunition storage depot.
But as the conflict continued, bombs had to be dropped, and inevitably there were to be some casualties.
On the 16th of April, I was launched as leader of a two-ship Sea Harrier formation, Vixen 2-3, to go over Bosnia on a close air support, a standard mission over Bosnia. While we were over there, 20 minutes into the sortie, we were tasked by Magic, the controlling agency, to contact Fortune 3, who's a forward air controller there, in Garajda. On doing so, he sounded very worried. The whole city was getting shelled. We could hear shells over the radio. He said that the 2 tanks on the northern ridge were actually carrying out the shelling. And he wanted to investigate and identify the tanks as Serbian tanks, which we did. And we took 3 passes to identify 2 tanks. We then set about a racetrack to do bombing runs. On each of the runs, each 3 first runs, it wasn't possible to drop a bomb because of collateral damage. We couldn't be sure that the bomb wouldn't hurt friendlies or where the bomb would go, basically. So we attempted a 4th pass, which I attempted. Again, the same situation, couldn't really identify the friendlies, so we couldn't drop. Pulled off the target. And going through about 4,000 feet, there was a massive bang and a flash, and the aircraft was upside down. I then gathered my thoughts together after looking at the warning panel. Obviously the aircraft had been hit by a missile. The aircraft was on fire. I righted the aircraft so it was right way up, but still descending. It was then that I decided to eject from the aircraft. On pulling the handle, there's a large bang underneath your seat and a large rush of wind and a blackout as such, I suppose, with the blood rushing from your head. And then the next thing I knew was a huge tug between my legs as the parachute opened, obviously decelerating from 300 knots to 0 knots in about half a second. So it's bound to be quite a tug. It was then all quiet as I floated down in the parachute and landed on in not such a nice style, but it was functional. I got taken to UN headquarters in Garajda and then flown out by helicopter back to our call a couple of days later via Sarajevo.
The road to the Harrier as an effective fighting machine has been long and hard. The only truly vertical takeoff aircraft before it was the helicopter, which still has its limitations. They're difficult to maintain, expensive to run, and slow compared to a jet fighter. After World War II, there were various experiments in ducting air as a means of propulsion rather than a propeller. This same principle was applied to the vertical people mover, designed to help troops fly over impossible terrain. Back in 1957, Boeing were experimenting with their Vertol Model 76 tilt-wing research aircraft, which was to be powered by a single 850 horsepower Lycoming shaft turbine, geared to drive a pair of 3-bladed rotor propellers mounted on a tilted wing. The real thing actually flew on the 13th of August 1957, and by May 1961 it had completed no less than 448 successful flights. Earlier, Rolls-Royce had been experimenting with its weird-looking flying bedstead. The TMR, or thrust measuring rig, was little more than 2 5,000-pound thrust Neen engines mounted with fuel tanks, controls and a pilot seat. The French were also in on the act, with this Attar Vallon, which first left the ground in 1957. 2 years later, Snecmar came up with the Coleoptère. This prototype crashed. Back in the States, the race for vertical takeoff produced some weird and wonderful contraptions, like this Doak convertiplane. Chrysler decided that 2 straight ducted engines would do the trick. Germany managed to get a little closer with the EWR-101C, which was built to provide information for a proposed VTOL Mach 2 fighter. And Dornier produced its own version of the flying bedstead. The American Bell Company tried 2 swiveling J-44 jets, which could point backwards, downwards, or at any angle in between. It was quite effective as a system, which developed into the X-14, powered by 2 Armstrong-Siddeley Vipers with a cascade vane system to give it lift.
This is the jet-powered X-14, a test aircraft being flown at NASA's Ames Research Center near San Francisco. Although it looks like a conventional airplane, it can take off and land straight up and down. One of the men who flies the X-14 at Ames is test pilot Ron Gertis.
It's different in that it is a VTOL aircraft, and that stands for vertical takeoff and land. This aircraft can take off and land vertically by the thrust provided by 2 jet engines. And it can hover just like a helicopter can. Now, the thing that makes it different is that it is a research vehicle. We can vary the way this aircraft responds to its controls and thus do some basic research on VTOL control systems. You also might note that we have an open cockpit in this airplane. It's probably one of the few open cockpit jets flying today.
NASA is doing research on vertical takeoff and landing planes like the X-14 to study problems associated with a workable intercity transport system for the future.
By 1958, Rolls-Royce had converted their flying bedstead into a realistic aircraft. The Short's SC-1, which achieved its first transition into wing-borne flight in 1960. It had no less than 5 Rolls-Royce RB108 engines. 4 were mounted vertically to give it lift, while the 5th was mounted in the tail to push it into forward flight. Hovering was achieved by partially swivelling the down-thrust engines and partly by reaction control valves at the end of each wing, the nose and the tail. Crude as it was, it did work. Across the Atlantic, the Ryan Company tried to keep the problem simple by sitting the aircraft on its tail. This test rig developed into the X-13, or the Ryan Vertijet, which was powered by a Rolls-Royce Avon engine. It had exhaust jet deflection to control it in the hover, and air jets in the wingtips to control roll. It managed to transition from vertical into horizontal forward flight in 1955. It also managed to transition back into its vertical hover, but its major problem was that it had to be guided back to its mooring tower, which the pilot couldn't even see. The whole idea was a bit of a non-starter, as it would be very difficult to hide those towers on the battlefield, even though it could be transported on the back of a truck. The Lockheed Company had also experimented with their VTOL tail-sitter. The XFV-1 had a huge contra-rotating prop, and it was given a rather Mickey Mouse undercarriage to help it take off conventionally before hovering in the air and transitioning back into normal flight. Again, this was an idea that never really progressed, as its limitations, well, they were pretty obvious. But in the late 50s, Sir Sidney Cam of Hawkers directed his team to design an airframe based on an idea of a Frenchman, Michel Vibeau, for a single-engined vertical takeoff fighter called the GR7. This design was to become the P-1127. This strange-looking beast with its bicycle undercarriage had a single engine mounted in the center of the aircraft. The cockpit was fairly conventional, with the addition of a nozzle control for the engine exhausts. And because of the jet exhausts, it couldn't have a tricycle undercarriage. It was on the 21st of October 1960 that Hawker's chief test pilot Bill Bedford, with his leg in plaster after a car accident, managed to get XP-831 into a tethered hover, even though the engine barely had enough poke to provide both lift and power for the reaction control system, which are puffers at the extremities of the aircraft to keep it stable. Indeed, the secret of the concept was the brainchild of Sir Stanley Hooker and his team from the Bristol Aero Engine Company, who reasoned, like Michel Vibeau, that it was possible to design a single engine that would raise the aircraft vertically by vectoring thrust through 4 nozzles pointing to the ground. By swivelling those nozzles, it should be possible to convert the aircraft into forward flight. Within a month, Bill Bedford had mastered the art of hovering with Stanley Hooker's Pegasus engine. Gradually, he managed to convert the hover to forward jet-borne flight. But there were still the problems of getting the right feel in the controls, the right gearing between the throttle and the engine. There were aerodynamic problems when the jet efflux blew underneath the wings and onto the tailplane. XP 836 was used to explore the problems of wing-borne flight. On the 12th of September 1961, VSTOL became a reality when it transitioned from hovering to conventional flight and back again.
We'd done it. We realized then that we had made the important step forward and proved the basic concept, although there was a very large amount of development work that had to be done to refine it for operational use.
During these experiments, the power of the Pegasus engine had been increased from 11,000 pounds of static thrust to 13,500 pounds. The aircraft had been designed not just to be experimental, but operational, with the strength to last 3,000 hours of punishing short takeoffs, flights and landings. Another bonus was that the P-1127 could land and take off from grass, unlike any other jet fighter of its time. But a major problem was getting the approach angle from the hover into the landing right. If the nose dropped close to the ground, the result was a smashed nose wheel. There were quite a few of them. This was certainly not the kind of vertical takeoff that Sidney Cam had envisaged in his P-1127. In the early 60s, Ryan was again involved in a VSTOL experiment. This time it was a transport aircraft, the XC-142A, which had an extra fan behind the tail to stabilize it. This large aircraft made its first hover on the 29th of December 1964. 3 days later, it made 2 transitions from hover to horizontal flight. By 1967, Dornier's flying bedstead had developed into the DOE 31E with 2 removable lift jet pods at the wingtips. It was an historic moment in 1963 when Bill Bedford landed the P-1127 on Ark Royal, full of hope that the Navy would be impressed. "25 years later, he recalled his seaborne reaction.
Yeah, it's fairly relaxed from my point of view. Lots of comments made about you'll buckle the deck, you'll deafen the captain, and you'll blow the crew overboard. But nothing dramatic like that happened.
But alas, the Navy was not impressed, partly because the machine couldn't carry enough stores and armaments, and it didn't have enough range for their liking. But at about this time, the Russians were developing their VSTOL, the Yak-38 Forger, powered by a main thrust engine and 2 lift jets. But the Dassault Balzac, based on the Mirage 3, had no less than 4 pairs of Rolls-Royce RB108 lift jets and a Bristol Siddeley Orpheus main engine. Trials began in October 1962. Only 1 prototype was ever built, and that was involved in 2 fatal accidents. The Hawker P-1127 was the only VSTOL aircraft to do its job with 1 engine. By 1963, the vectored thrust system had been thoroughly tested, and Hawker were eager to show off their new aircraft at the Paris Air Show that year, where it would be seen against the Dassault Balzac. Bill Bedford began his display showing off the P-1127 at its very best.
I completed my decelerating transition, was in the middle of a pirouette when suddenly the bottom fell out of my lift and I felt myself plummeting earthwards, and ignominiously I crashed in front of the president's tent on the concrete platform, with a progressive disintegration of the undercarriage and very expensive noises taking place.
A year later, the aircraft was christened Kestrel, after the hovering bird of prey. 9 Kestrels were part of a special tripartite squadron set up to evaluate its operational possibilities. The RAF, Luftwaffe, and the United States Army, Navy, and Air Force all allotted pilots to this American-backed NATO program. Kestrel was powered by now by the Pegasus 5 derated to 15,000 pounds of static thrust, giving it an extra 4,000 pounds of poke. The squadron had 10 pilots flying 9 Kestrels initially from Hawker Siddeley's airfield at Dunsfold. After conversion, the squadron moved to West Raynham in Norfolk on April Fool's Day 1965, when a US Army pilot managed to crash a Kestrel on the very first day. Ironically, the RAF, just like the Royal Navy, had its reservations about the Kestrel, as it too wanted a supersonic fighter.
For conventional takeoff. Alpha, clear for takeoff.
The new aircraft had a number of improvements on the prototypes, with truly swept-back wings. The tail was anhedral or drooping to stop the efflux problems, and the reaction control system, the puffers, could now blow air both up and down, giving the aircraft even more manoeuvrability. In the 9 months that the squadron lasted, it clocked up more than 900 sorties and put the Kestrel well ahead of any of its rivals. In spite of political interference when the supersonic P-1154 was cancelled in 1964, the RAF eventually got a very different version of Kestrel, with more power, an inertial navigation and weapons system, and a head-up display for the pilot. It became the Harrier GR1, standing for Ground, Attack and Reconnaissance. The RAF ordered 77 GR1s. A pilot who found himself flying the new vertical takeoff Harrier was Air Commodore Paddy Hine.
It was a real handful to operate, and of course you had the added dimension of the VSTOL flight regime. And I had never really flown helicopters apart from a 2 weeks induction course. And there's something slightly unnatural about bringing a high-performance combat fighter down below its normal stalling speed.
With its swiveling nozzles, all the pilot had to do was set the stop to 60 degrees, the speed bug to 90 knots, push the throttle lever forward, at 90 knots, pull the nozzle lever back, then gently ease it forward to transition into wing-borne flight. In RAF Germany, its mission was close air support for the British Army. 3, 4 and 20 squadrons were the first line of defence if the Soviet Union had launched an armoured assault from East Germany.
In many ways, I would say that the Harrier was the most interesting aircraft that I've operated in the RAF because of the off-main base deployment option. And we in Germany at that time, this was 1974-75, were much involved in developing that concept. And we could use stretches of road that might be in forests or on the outskirts of villages. We could use the villages in which to hide aircraft. Many of our war sites at that time were in villages themselves. So developing that concept was pioneering stuff.
Because of its short range, but its ability to attack, then hide near to the front line, the Harrier was used on many sorties a day, either in its attack role or photographing the enemy. Number 1 Squadron flew their GR1s to RAF Akrotiri on the island of Cyprus, which proved to be an ideal training ground. But a major problem had been converting pilots from other fighters to the single-seat GR1. The 2-seater version had been a long time in coming because of directional stability problems and the extra length needed to house 2 pilots. The T Mark II was finally cleared in 1971, and the accident rate came down quite dramatically. The Russians had also found the same problem with the Yak-38, So they produced a two-seater version, the Yak 38U. Of the 90 single-seaters, 37 are known to have been lost. It was ironic that the one American body that wasn't represented in the Kestrel tripartite squadron was the Marines. At the time, they had thought that the Kestrel simply didn't have the payload range that they required. But they did need a high-performance, fixed-wing V-STOL aircraft. And with the Harrier, they felt they'd found one. They stuck to the Aden guns, which had proved so successful in Europe. But they were the first to equip their Harriers, which they renamed AV-8A, with AIM 9E Sidewinder missiles. This meant that the Harrier acquired an air-to-air combat role for the first time. But some of the pilots were a little apprehensive.
Learning the difference between conventional flight and the transition phase into V-STOL, or vertical and short takeoff and landing, that transition there is probably the most difficult thing to learn. But it's like anything else. It's like learning to walk. Once you learn how, it's easy.
By 1974, the Marine Corps had 4 squadrons of AV-8As operational. 110 aircraft had been brought from Hawker Siddeley. With its missiles and bombs, Harrier was coming of age. Another first for the Marines was that the Harrier was operated at sea, launched from the decks of Marine Corps assault ships, which meant that it was being pushed to its full potential for the first time, and this was in spite of American political opposition. In Europe, the RAF was still in a state of readiness as the Cold War with the Warsaw Pact continued. The philosophy of quick frontline turnarounds meant that the Harriers could carry a smaller payload but attack many times in a day because they could land so close to the action. Even the 18 Matra Sneb rockets per pod, which could be fired singly, in a ripple or all at once, could be loaded very quickly once the crews got the hang of it. The Sneb were the one link between the GR1 and the GR3, which had the same basic airframe, but the 3 had a new nose housing a laser rangefinder and target seeker. It had new radar-seeking aerials on the tail and an uprated Pegasus 11 engine pushing out 21,500 pounds of thrust, plus the Ferranti FE541 inertial navigation and attack system. Life in Germany in the late 1970s for the GR1s and 3s became fairly routine, with photographic or reconnaissance sorties where 5 cameras were carried in a pod under the centre fuselage and attack exercises. So far, the Royal Navy was still resisting a sea-going version of Harrier. But again, because of political cutbacks, their carrier fleet was getting smaller. So, Hawker Siddeley decided to have another go at convincing the powers to be that the Harrier actually did work. Their demonstrator, G. VTOL, was dispatched to the helicopter cruiser HMS Blake in 1970. But because of the small deck space, the Harrier was greatly restricted in its payload, as it had to take off and land vertically. What was needed was short takeoff and vertical landing, STOVL. Conventional seaborne fighters still had to use complex systems to launch and retrieve them, which both the British and Americans relished. Firstly, the cumbersome expanding deck cables used to slow the many tons of fighters in just a few feet. For takeoff, huge blast plates had to be raised from the deck before the aircraft was loaded onto a gigantic steam catapult. In this case, the Phantom was hooked up by yet another cable. When everything was checked, the fighter was literally thrown into the air in just a few seconds. How much simpler and more economic to get your aircraft to gracefully join the ship and land vertically. One of the unique features of the Harrier was that it did away with the catapult altogether, using its tried and tested rolling takeoff. Another staggeringly simple improvement was invented by a keen skier, Lieutenant Commander Doug Taylor, in 1973. He reasoned that with a curved ramp at the bow of the ship, the exit angle from that ramp, no matter how bowed down the front of the ship was, would always be up. In August 1977, the first trial ski jump was tried at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, Bedford. It was found that the aircraft literally got a kick in the pants on liftoff, so it needed only half its rolling takeoff speed and a third of the deck roll compared to the flat deck. The Royal Navy had seen reason in 1973 and ordered a new version of the Harrier, the FRS-1, Fighter, Reconnaissance and Strike. On the 2nd of April 1982, Argentina invaded the British Protectorate of the Falkland Islands in the South Atlantic. Its claim was that the Malvinas Islands historically belonged to Argentina. Britain's response was to assemble a task force of some 40 warships, including the aircraft carriers Invincible and Hermes. As the Falklands were 8,000 miles away, it was to take at least 2 weeks to get there. As Britain had no airfields within thousands of miles, the only aircraft that could be used for air defence of the fleet was the V-Stol Harrier. The Sea Harrier had a Ferranti Blue Fox air intercept radar in the nose for its air defence role and an autopilot control system, and it was equipped with AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles. Its task was round-the-clock protection of the fleet against any Argentine air attack. There were 20 Sea Harriers, which were later reinforced by 8 more. Compared to the GR1, the Sea Harrier's pilot seat had been raised 11 inches, which meant that he had a much better all-round vision. During the slow journey to the southern Atlantic, the Harrier pilots and their crews practiced all the skills they would need in their first real conflict. They practiced attacking surface shipping, where the inertial navigation system really came into its own. They trained for combat air patrol as they got nearer and nearer to the islands. The Marines who were to attempt the recapture honed their skills too. With the task force in position, the RAF mounted Operation Black Buck. On the 30th of April, a Vulcan bomber dropped 21 1,000-pound bombs on the runway at Port Stanley, the capital of the Falklands. After its 6th air refueling from Victor tankers, the Vulcan completed the longest bombing run in aviation history, 7,860 miles, before landing back at Ascension Island in the central Atlantic. This was followed up by Sea Harrier ground attacks on May the 1st. These and other attacks proved to the Argentinians that in spite of a lack of airfields, Britain was capable of long-range bombing and that the Argentinians were forced to pull back some of their air force just in case of an attack on Buenos Aires itself. The RAF also contributed No. 1 Squadron GR3 Harrier fighter bombers based on HMS Hermes.
And we were going down there in an air defence role initially, but we couldn't carry missiles. So there are a number of modifications which had to be done to the programme in pretty short order. Having got down there, then there are obviously limitations of the aircraft which were known before, but the conflict confirmed. short range, limited payload, not a particularly effective nav system, and a very limited self-defense system. And indeed, we lost aircraft down there to ground fire.
In the dogfights that followed, a trick learned from the Americans called viffing fooled many of the Argentinian pilots when the Harriers seemingly stopped in mid-air. But the French had not only supplied Argentina with Super Étendards and Mirage 3s, they had also sold them long-distance sea-skimming Exocet missiles, which, because of a lack of an airborne early warning system, meant that many of the British ships were decimated. Again, on May the 1st, a Sea Harrier flown by an RAF exchange pilot, Flight Lieutenant Paul Barton, downed an Argentine Mirage with a Sidewinder. The Harrier was at war, and it was to destroy more than 20 Argentine jets. The air battle for Port Stanley raged. The Argentinians shot down 9 Harriers, all from ground fire.
So I think when we came home from the conflict, number one, we've now learnt how to operate with the Navy. Let's continue to try to do it, maybe on an annual basis. And indeed we succeeded in doing that until the end of the GR3 era. We're about to start again now with the GR7. We confirmed the need for an electronic warfare system, and ideally a fully automated one, integral to the aircraft, and that's what we've got in the GR7, and I think that carried across from the lessons there. We learnt the need for self-defense missiles, and indeed a late modification for the GR7 put 2 missiles on it, again as a direct result of our involvement in that conflict.
The Argentinians surrendered on June the 14th, 1982. Even after the success of the GR3s in the conflict, a bigger Harrier was needed. The GR5, built by McDonnell Douglas and British Aerospace, was test flown at Boscombe Down in 1985. 10 years earlier, the British government had withdrawn all funding for further Harrier development. But McDonnell Douglas had joined forces with the US Marine Corps to produce the AV-8B, with a bigger carbon fibre wing and a modern raised cockpit based on their F-15 layout. In March 1988, the RAF flew its first sortie in the new plastic Mark V, which was designed to fulfill a battlefield interdiction role, attacking targets deep behind the enemy's front line. But it also had a multi-role capability and a hugely increased range, with its retractable refueling probe. The plastic wing had much bigger flaps, which meant that the aircraft could lift off a heavier bomb load, and the larger wing area allowed for 4 pylons a side instead of 2. It also meant that the outriggers could be brought in from the wingtips, so that the aircraft could negotiate narrower roads, which the RAF had asked for. A year later, in 1989, with the breakup of the Soviet Union and communism, NATO's role was to completely change. Suddenly, its main enemy was seeking peace. Again, the British government seized on the opportunity to cut the RAF's budgets drastically. The document, called Options for Change, was presented to Parliament on the 25th of July 1990. 1 week later, Iraq invaded Kuwait. Within 4 days, it was occupied. The Iraqi dictator, Saddam Hussein, had an army of 1 million men, 5,000 tanks, and an air force of 500 aircraft. The United Nations couldn't allow him to dominate the Arabian oil fields. A vast coalition force was assembled in the Persian Gulf within 5 months.
5 months ago, Saddam Hussein started this cruel war against Kuwait. Tonight, the battle has been joined. Our goal is not the conquest of Iraq. It is the liberation of Kuwait.
Operation Granby, or Desert Shield, was led by American General Norman Schwarzkopf, who had overall command. At his right hand was General Chuck Horner, commander of the Allied Air Forces. His job was to gain air superiority before the ground troops moved in. At 1:30 on the 17th of January 1991, Desert Shield became Desert Storm when Tomahawk cruise missiles were launched from Allied ships in the Gulf at the Iraqi capital, Baghdad. They were followed by wave upon wave of coalition bombers hitting radar stations and communications. Over 200 targets were hit in the first 10 minutes alone.
And it was essential in those first few days of war that we quickly established air superiority, and insofar as we were able, we kept the Iraqi Air Force on the ground. We were vulnerable on our own main bases through overcrowding. We had tens of thousands of troops arriving in theatre and deploying forward to their combat assembly areas, and we were vulnerable to air attack. And so we had to ensure that there was no air attack.
Among the 2,430 coalition aircraft, the US Marines used their AV-8B Harrier IIs for close air support. The overall effect was to completely neutralize the Iraqi Air Force, who were either shot down or fled. Desert Storm lasted 38 days and left the way open for the land battle, Operation Desert Force, which started at 4 a.m. on the 24th of February 1991. Unlike the Harriers, the Tornadoes used very accurate laser-guided bombs. LBGs detect the splash of laser light reflected off the target, a light that comes from an airborne laser designator. The veteran Buccaneers initially provided this service for the Tornadoes before they got their own airborne laser designator, the GEC Marconi TL Pod. Such was the success of Allied air superiority that the ground war lasted a mere 100 hours.
That illustrated to me the degree of effectiveness that air power had inflicted in terms of attrition.
Iraqi surrender was swift, but its airspace would have to be patrolled well after the conflict was over. This was to be one of the Harrier's roles in Operation Warden.
Well, the 7's been in service for about 5 years now, and we've already made great progress with its introduction to service, and indeed it's been blooded in operations over Bosnia and Iraq already. A number of improvements have gone into the aircraft. As we look forward, ideally it's going to see us through to somewhere around 2015.
In June 1997, a 2-week exercise, Operation Hillfoil, involving 9 NATO nations, was directed by the commander of the Harrier Force, Group Captain Clive Loader. His base was a disused airfield at Sculthorpe in Norfolk.
I'm not sure if we're going to learn anything new, except to say that we need to practice the type of operation that we've seen over Bosnia and Iraq. They don't just happen. You can't just go to theatre and expect on day one to get those things right. They are complicated processes, both in the planning and in the coordination and the execution of those sorties. And it's very important for NATO that it is able to practice these in the appropriate scenario so that it has a high confidence level that when you go on operations, when after all, on day one, people may well be firing things at you, surface to air and air to air, that you've already got your game plan worked out, you're professional, and the losses will be absolutely minimised. since the demise of the Cold War, we've revamped the Harrier Force concept of operations, and the government requires us to be able to operate from a spectrum of locations, from a fully found, fully hardened NATO-type base, right down through a civil military airfield to an austere location where we have to go and take everything that we need, all the consumables of war, and indeed all of the other admin support of people who are going to support the aircraft's operation. All of that has to be brought into a bare base airfield, and that is exactly what we're practicing here at Sculthorpe. And yes, it is very typical of what we could be asked to do. You only have to think about things that are going on in Africa and the like at the moment. We could be asked to go and carry out reconnaissance and other operations from places where there would be very little indigenous support.
We have been too flexible for our own good, and clearly the risk is, you become a jack of all trades. And indeed, with the advent of UN peacekeeping operations over Bosnia, everything now moving up to medium to high level in those theatres, but still having to retain the low-level capability, the demands that we're making of the young aircrew compared to when I joined the Harrier Force, I mean, they're significantly greater, and I continue to be impressed with the way they can get their minds around the problem and do it.
So how does the Harrier Force choose its new pilots?
We are looking for somebody that Valley, as the output of the advanced training system, says, here is an individual who is capable of flying a single-seat aeroplane. He's got the hands and the feet and the mind to fly the thing properly and work on his own. Beyond that, you're looking with someone with bags of capacity, frankly, because when it gets busy, and I think when it gets dark, single-seat, low-level operations at night, you need a bit of spare capacity around.
But how did Malcolm White become a Harrier pilot himself?
I'd been flying Hunters at Wittering, and whilst doing my ground school on the Hunter, I'd watched a number of unfortunate incidents with a Harrier, and had gone home saying, well, the last thing I'm ever going to do is fly that aeroplane. And then later, as things happen, I was selected to go to the Harrier OCU. I went down there, I have to say, concerned. The first solo that you did in the aeroplane was a vertical takeoff. Yes, and we'd flown a few hours in a helicopter, but I had really not put my mind around sitting in a hover with several tons of metal. And when I finally got up there and everything was working and I wasn't drifting all over the airfield, I do recall sitting there thinking, my God, this is fun. Not as much fun as when I was landed, I was still in one piece, but that's really my memory of the first trip.
There are weapons and weapon aiming systems which are in the pipeline for us, which are very important. You'll have seen in the Gulf War, for example, the use of TIAL, the Thermal Imaging Airborne Laser Designator. It's very important for us that we get the ability to have that system on our own aircraft, because if you, all the while you have to rely on another aircraft type to do your designation for you, then you also limit the ability and to deploy to different airfields and different locations. What we want to be able to do is be able to do the whole job with Harrier aircraft.
We now have a very genuine night capability, and indeed we have a poor weather capability by day. So that's a significant improvement. But in addition, with the additional pylons, the additional fuel load, we can carry a combination of a greater payload further, or a smaller payload a lot further, and that's giving us the ability to engage in other conventional Air Force operations like air interdiction, or indeed the offensive counter-air campaign, although clearly that's primarily the role of the Tornado Force.
Tornado and Harrier pilots had many things in common in Bosnia, as this Tornado pilot explains.
A rollout here is far more difficult than, for example, Desert Storm. Because in Desert Storm we had one enemy. Here there are many factions involved. Politically it's more sensitive, and we have a lot of UN troops dispersed throughout the area. So in terms of making a political decision to prosecute attack, that is a difficult decision, and to make sure we don't cause any fratricide, that is difficult militarily. So overall, it is a very sensitive operation, both politically and militarily.
In 1995, the Serbs continued to ignore all United Nations warnings. The world and the media were appalled. So in July, a meeting was convened in London between officials providing troops to the UN effort and the Americans to call an end to the conflict. NATO was ordered to instigate airstrikes against the Serbs. The European Rapid Reaction Forces moved into position in Bosnia. In August, the Serbs again started shelling Sarajevo, but this time NATO struck back. This was the start of Operation Deliberate Force. But how much does the media influence political and therefore military action?
Through the media that gets forces deployed into theatre, and ironically with minimal losses. And here I would, for example, cite the shooting down of Captain O'Grady in the F-16.
Captain Scott O'Grady had been shot down by a Serb missile over Bosnia. He hid for 6 days before he was rescued and returned to America as a fighting hero.
The men and women of the Navy and the Marines came in there and saved me. And if you want to find some heroes, that's where you should look, because those are the biggest heroes in the world, as far as you want to ask me who the hero is. So that's all I've got to say. I'm getting pretty emotional right now, so I'm going to cut it off right here. And again, thank you, and God bless you all. Thank you.
And you'll remember the public outcry at the loss of that aircraft and indeed the French Mirage.
This time, Captain Pierre Clery got his crippled étendard home.
It's also public pressure that can cause aircraft to be pulled out of peace support operations, perhaps before they should be. And therefore, to any politician who has to make the decision to put aircraft in there to try and dampen down the situation, to him it's very important to have an aircraft which is survivable in the mission and to have the types of weapons which will minimise the threat of our aircraft being lost on those operations.
In spite of the Navy's initial resistance to the Harrier, their FRS-2 has given it remarkable service in its operational life, with an almost faultless readiness record, which may have something to do with the unsung maintenance crews below decks here on Ark Royal in Bosnian waters.
We've got 6 Harriers, just over 100 men here to maintain them and arm them. And out here at the moment, we've really got 3 roles. We've got the offensive counter-air role, which is the primary mission for which the aircraft was designed for in the first place. Aside from that, we've got an attack role. And then on top of that, a reconnaissance role. And in fact, the majority of our work out here at the moment is close air support, attack, if you will, and reconnaissance flight. The squadron has 10 pilots, which is the normal number for a squadron with this number of aircraft. And that means that we each get to fly once a day, occasionally twice a day, depending on what the task is.
The results of our strikes have, in my assessment, been very successful. I must tell you that we've had some weather problems. We've obviously missed some targets. But overall, I believe that we are being very successful in the prosecution of these air operations.
At least Operation Deny Flight forced the Serbs to the negotiating table and brought the possibility of peace to Bosnia.
Because of the time scales for development of new aircraft these days, it won't surprise you to know that we're already well down the road of looking for the successor to the Harrier. Whether it's a vertical landing and vertical takeoff type aircraft, I don't yet know. It will certainly be an aircraft which will have a very short takeoff capability and a very short landing capability for the reasons that I outlined earlier on.
Well, 23 years down the road, I love it. I've been very lucky. I've been all over the world in it. Falklands, Belize, various parts of the States, an exchange tour, on-board ship. Middle East, Norway. So far, she never let me down. And I've had a great kick out of the aeroplane, the way in which we operated. But there's no doubt, above all else, the people that I've worked with and known in the force over the years.
In spite of crippling government cutbacks over the years and the initial lack of faith, the Harrier has become indispensable to NATO in an ever-changing world. It is still the only operational V-STOL fighter in the West, and it will be developed still further, with fly-by-wire, better munitions, and more power. The Harrier force will continue to prove that it is truly a force to be reckoned with.